I intended this paper, which is to say, I think I expected, or was expecting, to present a paper about the relationships between face vessels that you find in the Edgefield area of South Carolina with their African, that is to say, Kongo origins. For reasons that I think, that I hope will become clearer in about 20 minutes, that paper, or if I'm being honest, my notes that would have become that paper are in New York, in my office, but I'm here with you in Florida. So let's see what happens. In the introduction to Kongo Across the Waters, editors Susan Cooksey, Robin Pointer, and Hein van Hay suggest that the book, its accompanying exhibition, and perhaps even this conference are all metaphors that describe one of the rich historic cultures of the world, having developed on this side of the water into a complex set of ideas, beliefs, and forms of expression, and on the other side of the water to include ideas about Africa and Congo as a land of origin in a vast diaspora, or as an other world veiled behind the land of the living. Much of the scholarship devoted to these metaphors has been driven by the impetus to document, historicize, codify, and display the connections that pertain between the cultures of Africa and those of the plantation Americas. This work enjoys a fruitful historiography, evident in the various projects that populate the panels of this conference. The work of drawing these links has been a long and arduous task, due in part to the difficulty of registering documentable relationships that are legible in the sundry disciplines, history, archaeology, anthropology, linguistics, and others, that comprise our various professional vocations. Our source material is strewn about in archives, it's scattered across continents, it's hidden underfoot. From these fugitive sources, we work feverishly to document cultures and connections that can be verified and validated, that are legible through the various methods of our chosen fields. But the work has also been made difficult by the hefty weight of academic opposition that has often accompanied the work. Writing in Cities of the Dead, Joseph Roach, following Michel Foucault, argues that because memory, that is to say history, is constituted by a series of nonlinear and continual surrogations, the search for origins is a futile, if not misguided, enterprise. And I'm quoting, "What is found at the historical beginning of things is not the inviolable identity of their origin. It is the dissension of other things. It is disparity." Writing similarly, Paul Gilroy argues that although African linguistic, political, and philosophical themes are still visible in Black Atlantic cultures for those who wish to see them, those are his words, not mine, for those who wish to see them, they have often been transformed and adapted by their new world locations to a new point where the dangerous issues of purified essences and simple origins lose all meaning, end quote. Taken together, these criticisms make clear that the question of Africa's role in the development of African American culture can be a vexed matter. Inevitably, it is highly political, as one historian recently noted. But going even further, anthropologist Richard Price suggests that something even more nefarious is afoot in this persistent desire to see African past in the cultures of Blacks throughout the plantation Americas. Writing in an essay called On the Miracle of Creolization, Price maintains, and I'm quoting him here, that it is too hard to escape the conclusion that ideology and politics, the specifics of North American identity politics, continue to direct the master narratives as well as influence how they are read, end quote. Amounting to, quote, a motivated erasure of countervailing scholarship, Price suggests that these identity politics are rooted in ideological parti pris. In effect, Price charges scholars who chart the persistent role that the long arm of Africa played in the cultures of Blacks throughout the Americas, as well as their sympathizers and apologists, with bending or ignoring counter-evidence to support ideological positions. In this sense, scholars who argue for the centrality of Africa in the study of African American cultures are likely presenting an ideological position based on identity politics rather than an academic position based on evidence. Of course, some have bristled under these criticisms. Michael Gomez, for example, responded to Price and others by suggesting that the cultural and social formations of transported Africans tend to invite a quality of critique unique in its elevated level of scrutiny. That's Gomez. In my own contribution to Kongo Across the Waters, I argue that in creating folk cultures around the diaspora, enslaved Africans drew on remarkably resilient aspects of African culture that spurred on cultural developments in the Americas, even as these cultures remained plastic, being malleable enough to adapt to new conditions. In this vast field of cultural inheritance and cultural ingenuity, Africa is what you make it. It is a language and the folklore that flows from it. It is a song and the ring shout that circles us. It is carved, molded, woven, and crafted into shape. When you hear me crying, I'm building me a home. Following Saidiya Hartman, I'm proposing a vision of the African diaspora as an arena of insurgent nostalgia, or a sort of restive remembrance and embodiment of the past. For Hartman, Blacks throughout the diaspora reconstituted and reconfigured elements of African culture through a series of sacralized and ancestral elements created, imagined, and remembered in the use of prayer trees and inverted pots, performed in the ring shout, called up in sacred gatherings, devotional dances to ancestral spirits, and in otherwise, these are Hartman's words, remembering things they had not witnessed or experienced. Remembering things they had not witnessed or experienced. I'll leave for the moment any reference to Toni Morrison's notion of remembering. I'll leave that for the moment. In this view, insurgent nostalgia transformed the space of captivity into one inhabited by the revenants of a disremembered past. Those are Hartman's words again. While I find great value in Hartman's notion of insurgent nostalgia, I want to challenge the idea that Blacks in the plantation Americas understood themselves most significantly in terms of loss and displacement, or that, as Hartman says, the history of the captive emerges precisely at the site of loss and rupture. Whatever we might say about Black cultures in the plantation Americas, and whatever claims we might make about the relationship between these cultures and the cultures of Africa, from which the Africans from the principal slave regions of the continent, my own view is that the African diaspora and its cultures are whole, notwithstanding their distance, both temporal and geographic, from a supposed African precedent. Black culture in the plantation Americas is not only connected to African past through a set of documentable cultural behaviors, practices, or beliefs, as indeed it is connected, I want to be clear about that, but is also connected to similar insurgencies around the Atlantic, in Africa, throughout the Americas, and in Europe. In each instance, these cultures are drawing on the past to create cultures that critique their societies by expressing pressing political, cultural, societal concerns. At the beginning of this essay, I noted that the conveners of this conference used water as a metaphor to help articulate the historical and cultural relationships between Congo and the United States. Veering just a bit from that model, I'd like to consider another meteorological metaphor, the wind, as a way of illustrating some of my own ideas. Writing in Mama Day, novelist Gloria Naylor describes a wind that started on the shores of Africa, a simple breeze among the palms and cassavas, before it's carried off, tied up with thousands like it on a strong wave heading due west. Restless and disturbed, no land in front of it, no land in back, it draws up the ocean vapor and rains fall like tears. It rips through the sugar canes in Jamaica, stripping juices from their heart, shredding red buds from royal poincianas. A center grows within the fury, a still eye, warm, calm. It dries the line of clothes in Alabama. It rocks the cradle in Georgia. By the time the winds spin back around to the Carolina coast, they are all the rage. An old oak tree holds. The rest is destruction. Those winds are, as Ntozake Shange writes, the slaves who were ourselves. They are people tied up with thousands like them. They are the vast and varied cultures of the African diaspora. Those winds comprise cultures of succor and reprieve when they dry a line of clothes in Alabama, when they rock a baby to sleep in Georgia, but they are also a furious rebellion in Carolina, or in Haiti, or in Brazil. That list goes on and on. Rather than see these American winds as merely derivative of the African breeze that preceded it, lesser, lost, alienated winds, I'm arguing that a vision of the African diaspora as an arena of insurgent nostalgia recognizes the entire space as a crosshatch of currents, scratching, cutting, and clawing their way around the Atlantic Rim. These winds have histories. They follow roughly prescribed patterns and currents, but they are not mimetic or derivative. Taken together, they comprise a vast network of trade winds that crisscross the ocean. Unlike some who see futility in the search for African past, I want to emphasize that this insurgent nostalgia is rooted in the historical connections that bind African diasporic peoples together. These connections are meaningful and they're worth exploration, and the results of this research can't be dismissed as mere fantasy or base reduction. For example, Kamal Braithwaite is not producing a phantasm of Africa when he recalls the Caribbean winds that signaled St. Lucia's annual dry season. It was the seasonal dust cloud, he writes, drifting out of the great ocean of Sahara, the Harmattan. By an obscure miracle of connection, this Arab nomad wind, cracker of Fanti Wood 1,000 miles away, did not die on the seashore of West Africa, its continental limit. It drifted on, reaching the New World archipelago to create our drought, imposing an African season on the Caribbean Sea. And it was these winds too, and in this season, that the slave ships came from Guinea, bearing my ancestors to this other land. Braithwaite's Caribbean season originates in Africa, to be sure, though it is no mere derivation. The benefit of seeing the African diaspora as an arena of insurgent nostalgia is that it allows for the real, that is to say documentable, relationships that connect the waters and the winds and the peoples of the Atlantic. This goes a long way, I think, to respond to the charge made by Richard and Sally Price, among others, who suggest that, and I'm quoting from the Prices here, any determined researcher who is intent on proving a chosen historical scenario can almost always locate some objects or design styles in one tradition that closely resemble some objects or design styles in another, end quote. To my mind, the formal and aesthetic relationships at play here are not merely the result of some random comparisons of what seem to be similar cultural practices. Instead, they emerge out of the historical relationships between peoples. At the same time, insurgent nostalgia encourages a full consideration of the ways that cultural practices and behaviors provide pressing political, social, and aesthetic critiques, highlighted by their urgency, by their immediacy. I'd like to turn now briefly to a consideration of how an idea of the African diaspora as a field of insurgent nostalgia might contribute to our understanding of the historical and continuing relationships between Congo and the United States. In the mid-19th century, African-American potters in the Edgefield district of South Carolina produced a fascinating set of ceramic vessels that have since inspired scholarly controversy across disciplines, as successive generations of historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, and others have debated their provenance and their ultimate significance. At the turn of the century, ceramic historian Edwin Barber described the vessels, I'm quoting him now, as weird-looking water jugs, roughly modeled in the form of a grotesque human face, evidently intended to portray the African features. For Barber, these vessels held particular interest, and I'm quoting again, as representing an art of the Southern Negroes uninfluenced by civilization. The modeling reveals a trace of Aboriginal art as formerly practiced by the ancestors of the makers in the Dark Continent, end quote. More recently, Robert Ferris Thompson, John Michael Blash, and others have provided more serious and sustained treatment of the African origins of vase vessels. Thompson, citing a vast tradition throughout West Africa of using multimedia and figural sculpture and the absence of such in European pottery traditions, argues, and I'm quoting from Thompson here, there is nothing in Europe remotely like the vase vessels. For his part, Vlash has drawn links between the face vessels and the Nkisi tradition in West Central Africa. For Vlash, and I'm quoting, "The face jugs with bulging white eyes and the small wooden statues with eyes made from white shells are endpoints," one thinks of bookends, "of a stylistic continuum stretching the breadth of the ocean." These formal and aesthetic connections have since been strengthened by reference to the 1858 arrival of the slave ship Wanderer that illegally imported a cargo of some 400 Africans onto Jekyll Island, Georgia in 1858. About 107 of those captives found their way to the Edgeville district where they ended up working on various potteries. Chris Bona has mentioned that briefly in his presentation. These newly arrived captives provided, in some historical arguments, the initial spark that inspired the subsequent, though brief, production of face vessels. But it wasn't long after Thompson and Vlash promoted what might be called a Kongo thesis for the face vessels. It wasn't long before critics became vocal in their opposition. In fact, some critics were, some early critics, were opposed even to the idea that blacks were the makers of the face vessels, much less that they had any African connection. John Burrison rejected the idea of an African connection on grounds, and I'm quoting from Burrison here, rejects the idea of an African connection on grounds that in order to seriously propose an African genesis for a black American tradition, the same tradition must be found in Africa. Further, one must demonstrate that the black American tradition in question is more likely to have been imported from Africa than developed independently and coincidentally as a domestic phenomenon, or borrowed from whites or Indians here who may have had a similar tradition. The problem with this critique, well, let me restate that. The problems with this critique are several, not least of which is that it presumes, even requires, that cultural practices on both sides of the Atlantic be static, frozen in time as if awaiting some future formal comparison. Not only that, but the cultures must also remain hermetically sealed, the one from the other, and from any outside influences. Nevertheless, this sort of criticism, not only in the case of face vessels, but elsewhere as well, this sort of criticism has often driven subsequent research and shaped the historiographical questions in the field. Elsewhere, I've written about some of my concerns on this question. I've expressed concern that too often, the central questions in these debates have been whether or not and to what extent African American cultures are authentically African, and whether or not or to what extent black people in the United States have retained, one might say performed, an authentic African past. In order to enter the fray of that debate, one must engage the debate on its own terms by presuming on the one hand that pasts are such as can be identified in their authenticity, and pasts and cultures are such as can be presented in their authenticity. And on the other, that the special task of an anthropology of black people consists of providing the evidence, both theoretical and methodological, necessary to debate the role of African past of black American culture. While I acknowledge not only the need, but indeed the importance of tracing African influences in black cultural practices, I do that, I am that. I don't want, I've said this is the third time I've said it now, I just want to be clear. That I acknowledge not only the need, but indeed the importance of tracing African influences in black cultural practices throughout the plantation Americas. I also want to emphasize that these practices are not to be mined only as inventories of African past. As it relates to face vessels, one can immediately imagine the ways that these vessels might be put to other, maybe better ends, to understand a whole range of projects, including the continual significance of African cultural continuities in the United States, but also the persistence of the transatlantic slave trade in the late 19th century, as a possible new idiom for sustaining African American religious beliefs while resisting slave power, as an early inspiration for the subsequent development of 20th century African American visual cultures. These vessels are one among many insurgencies, nostalgic insurgencies, happening around the Atlantic that communicate a particular relationship to Kongo art and aesthetics, to be sure, but that also reflects a communion with larger communities of people for whom slavery is the permanent name of a trial and tribulation which we are yet to overcome, and Africa the name of a difference, and therefore of a horizon of hopes at once moral, historical, aesthetic, and political. Thank you.